A lot of people have changed their views, of course, on offshore processing since the Howard government's Pacific solution was in place. Those in the Labor Party, none more so. They have now gone full circle. They're backing offshore processing. They say a deterrent like this is necessary and going for Nauru and Manus Island. The key planks of the Pacific solution after the recommendations from the Angus Houston Committee yesterday. The Greens, refugee advocates and also the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, though, maintain that offshore processing does not deter boat arrivals at all. For his reaction to what the Houston Committee has recommended and now what the Parliament is going to approve, I spoke to the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser a short while ago. Well, Malcolm Fraser, thank you very much for your time. Can I start by asking what your thoughts are on the recommendations of the Angus Houston Committee?
Well, I'm enormously disappointed. I think three very decent people have put forward a pretty lousy proposal. It's harsher in its consequences than John Howard's Pacific solution, and it's not going to work. They say this will stop people getting on boats, because that's the only way you're going to stop people drowning at sea. But why then are we spending what will, over time, be billions of dollars on offshore detention centres? If you think the policy will work, you're not going to need those detention centres, and it's going to be money that will be wasted. So really, the underlying assumption in the whole proposal is that people will go on getting on boats, and then they're going to be taken wherever they're picked up, to Nauru or Papua New Guinea, or to some wretched offshore centre. I think the thing that the committee has perhaps failed most on is that the policy of deterrence is almost proven not to have worked anywhere. Now, I know the Liberal Party claimed that it did in John Howard's time when the boat stopped, when they brought in the Pacific solution. But if you looked at the number of asylum seekers going to Europe, which had approached for a year or two about 400,000 a year, the numbers going to Europe fell just as dramatically, if not more dramatically. And none of the countries of Europe had introduced punitive deterrent policies. What had changed, the Taliban had fallen in Afghanistan, and the push factors from countries from which they were fleeing had altered dramatically. So it wasn't the deterrent factors that John Howard put in place that stopped the boats. It was quite changed circumstances in Afghanistan. So, you know, these are basic things which I think the committee has overlooked and not given adequate attention to. Perhaps they wanted to take a bit of Labor policy, a bit of Liberal policy. And
when you look at the Australian experience, we did see boats stop arriving when offshore processing was introduced, and when the Labor government then returned to onshore processing, we saw boats start to arrive. Now, do you concede there has been a shift, at least in public sentiment on this, that this debate has essentially been lost when it comes to offshore processing?
Oh, I don't know that it has. The last polls I saw showed a majority of people believe that there should be processing onshore. Now, that was a month or two ago. What's changed in that month or two, I'm not too sure. But whether the policy works or not depends not on what we do as an Australian government. It depends upon the circumstances in the countries from which people flee. And look, if people are going to be killed by the Taliban because they want to educate their daughters, and the penalty for educating girls under the Taliban was to be shot, and I checked that myself, there is nothing that you can do to match the terror from which people are fleeing. And, you know, these people are judged, or over 80% are judged to be genuine refugees by a pretty tough process, a process that Australia has controlled. And when you look at that, you know they are fleeing terror. You know they are not just economic migrants. If they're economic migrants, they'll get sent back. They won't be refugees. So our policy is designed to be as nasty as possible to very vulnerable people. And we shouldn't be particularly proud of that.
That there have been so many people losing their lives at sea, 604 since October of 2009, trying to reach Australia. This argument about treating the asylum seekers poorly is outweighed by the loss of life at sea, that it's better to at least not attempt that dangerous journey.
Well, I agree. And there are other ways in which they really would not attempt. I mean, what should happen, perhaps, take an example from the Indo-Chinese exodus, where there were tens of thousands of people processed in a holding centre in Malaysia, and we, America and Canada, took huge numbers of people out of that centre. You could establish a holding centre in Indonesia, and then they would not want to get on boats. But to do that, to get the Indonesians to agree, we would have to say we're going to take a very large number. And I suspect the government and the opposition just don't want to do that. But your question also overlooks the fact that having processing centres in Nauru and Papua New Guinea and whatever is not going to stop people getting on boats. They are still going to try to get to Australia. And, you know, the committee would not recommend spending very large sums on repairing and re-establishing those offshore detention centres unless they were confident that people were going to get on boats, because that's the way you get to Nauru. You get on a boat first, and then you get caught by Australia or by the Indonesians, and you end up in Nauru. So the policy as proposed implies that people are going to go on trying to get on boats.
And just finally, can I ask you, you said this in many respects is a harsher policy than the Howard government's Pacific solution. There will be more monitoring of mental health issues, greater access to non-government organisations. But, of course, there's this new principle of no advantage, which means asylum seekers could be stuck on Nauru and Manus Island for years, an indefinite period of time. That's something the Prime Minister is emphasising. Is this going to be a harsher policy than the Pacific solution?
It will be a harsher policy than the policy John Howard implemented because of that. And because of that, there will be more mental trauma, there'll be more mental breakdown, there'll be more attempted suicides. And you also have to remember that children will be in these detention centres. We are not only defiling the Refugee Convention, where it says that refugees should be treated equally if they're genuine, that people travel by unorthodox means and often without papers. It will also be going totally against the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It goes against all the rules against unlawful imprisonment. So there's a great deal against it. There are many Australian values that are totally destroyed by this particular policy.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Going to bring in our panel.